So, our next session is on government services. Just very quickly, let me take you through the general taxability of government services. Section 284 of the CGST Act declares central government, state government and local authority as a person. Then you have section 7 subsection 1 which says all forms of supply by a person in the course or furtherance of business are to be considered as a supply. Therefore, that section 7 where the meaning of supply is explained, which says that all forms of supply by a person, that person will have to be interpreted as per 2 subsection 24, which says that central government, state government and local authority are persons. Then of course, you have this in the course or furtherance of business. You come to the definition of business in 2 subsection 17 of the CGST Act, which says any activity or transaction undertaken by the central government, a state government or any local authority in which they are engaged as public authorities is a business. Mark these words, it is not just transaction, it is activity or transaction. So, therefore, there is a slight subtle difference in activity and transaction. A transaction may entail a contract, but activity does not entail contracts. Now, most of the supplies that the government gives will be services, very few like food which is given at subsidized rates, etc. Only that can be, according to me, a supply of goods. Most of them will be services. Now, why do I say that? Most of them will contain some kind of document which is made and issued to you. For example, a passport. Now, passport, it is true that a passport is a tangible object, but the issuance of passport is not a supply of goods, because passport itself firstly is not goods. To be goods, the definition of goods is contained in your CGST Act. That definition is same as the definition under Sale of Goods Act, and under the Sale of Goods Act and the sales tax laws which were there before GST. Under those laws, there was a specific requirement that goods should be marketable. It was also there in excise law. Now, a passport is not marketable, therefore, it cannot be goods. There are some case laws on this. It is not directly on passport, but an analogous principle. Question papers issued by universities are not goods because they are not marketable. Letterheads, receipt books, etc. are not goods. This is the Anandam Vishwanatham case of Supreme Court and Saraswati Printing Press, Bombay High Court. Both of them are very famous cases in sales tax. Now, even though most of the supplies given by the government will be services, whether every charge which is made by the government on a citizen or a person, whether it is consideration for any service, my answer is no. See, ordinarily special amenities and facilities provided by the government in return for a fee should be considered as a service. The tax which is levied, this property tax, etc., or various taxes which are levied under various statutes, all of them are not levied in return for any service. In fact, the definition of tax, you will find it in many case laws also. Definition of tax itself is that it is a compulsory exaction of funds for which there is no quid pro quo. What is a quid pro quo? Supply should be made in return for consideration. That in return for is what quid pro quo is. One cannot refuse to pay tax if no services are availed, nor can one really demand services in a contractual sense if they are not provided, or if the services provided by government are substandard. You cannot go to court for compensation against substandard services. Therefore, when a tax is levied, there is no real service which is provided. It cannot be, taxes cannot therefore be subject to GST, except in your valuation. There are some instances in which, for example, customs duty on import of goods is added to the value of supply. That is different. But property tax, as I said, there is a circular also in your societies. CBEC has issued a circular for societies and cooperative sector. They have also said that property taxes cannot be subjected to GST. Now, apart from taxes, you have fines and penalties which are levied under various statutes. See, fines and penalties are not consideration for any service. There are two case laws which I have cited here. They are in the PPT, Northampton Football Association, which is a UK case, and case 65, which is a New Zealand tribunal case. In those two cases, it has been very unequivocally laid out that the word service entails some benefit being received by the recipient. That definition of service under our law is same as the definition of service under the New Zealand statute GST law, and therefore, even despite that definition which says services is anything other than goods, the New Zealand tribunal has said at the same time you cannot ignore the ordinary meaning of services. You cannot say that disciplining someone, prosecuting someone, levying fines and penalties on someone is a service. How is that applicable to your government services? Towing charges. When your car is parked in the wrong way or whether it's parked where it should not be, towing charges are levied. Now, towing charges are not subject to GST. Why? Because cars are towed away against our wish, and therefore it cannot be service. For there to be a supply, the recipient should either need the supply or want the supply. If a supply is happening, if a transaction or an activity is happening against the wishes of the recipient, you cannot say that a supply has taken place. In fact, these towing charges are nothing but in the nature of confiscation. Now, however, a redemption fine or a fine in lieu of confiscation can be taxed, since it is consideration for tolerating an act and therefore it is taxable. Towing charges, as long as they represent penalty, are not taxable. However, if any redemption fine is levied for releasing the car, then it is very much taxable. Now, how do you go about checking whether, how do you go about determining whether a particular activity or transaction undertaken by the government is in fact a service or not? Always check whether there is any actual service to be provided by government which is contemplated under a legislation. For example, fees, and this example is very good also, it is a Supreme Court decision. Fees which are charged by Central Excise Department for undertaking audit of assessees were held not relatable to any service provided by the Excise Department. The case law, Supreme Court case law is Gupta Modern Breweries versus State of Jammu and Kashmir. Such fees are levied for undertaking work which is for government's own benefit and not for the benefit of the assessee, and therefore no service. The principle is that when, for example, in this case, that case was about the constitutionality of these fees. So, these observations were made in that vein. When the government takes fees for conducting audit of your books or for conducting audit of your factory, place of business, etc., it is really acting for its own benefit. It is not providing any service to the assessee. In that vein, the Supreme Court has said that there is no service and therefore this fee has no quid pro quo with any service as such. There is no quid pro quo at all. Also in that decision, a lot of case law was discussed and finally it was held that administrative charges like license fees are generally in nature of tax. Now, you have a lot of administrative charges like registration fees, etc. In each case, you have to see whether that quid pro quo exists. I advise all viewers to look up this case law. It's available on Google and Indian Qanun, and all the case laws which are discussed in that judgment, all of them are extremely relevant for understanding what is taxable and what is not taxable. There is a myth going around that everything that the government charges, every fee that the government recovers is leviable to GST now, unless it is specifically notified as not being leviable to GST. That is just a myth. Please try to see whether a quid pro quo exists, whether it is a service. Now, other examples are your CSR cess or compensation funds which are created under various statutes. There may be environmental statutes where a compensation cess is compensation fund is created. There are labor laws in which a compensation fund, I think this building workers act is also there, where the central government has created a compensation fund. The amounts which are charged for contribution to that fund, they are certainly not for any service. No GST can be levied on such charges. Now, exemptions and non-taxability. Services provided by court or tribunal are neither goods nor services. This is your Schedule 3, Clause 1 CGST. Services of funeral, burial, crematorium or mortuary, including transportation of deceased, are neither goods nor services. Schedule 3, Clause 4 CGST Act. Services by way of any activity in relation to a function entrusted to a panchayat under 243G of the Constitution is again neither goods nor services. So, all these activities are completely outside GST. Anything which is neither goods nor services goes outside the GST Act, because there is no other kind of transaction which is taxed. Now, this 243G, if you read it, it contains a huge list of like drinking water, rural housing, etc. Okay. That is of course because of this notification, all of that will be outside the CGST Act. However, even without the notification, where the function has no quid pro quo with any charges, as I said, there can be no tax liability. Now, lastly, there are individual exemption. There are a lot of exemption notifications, exemption entries, which contain various exemptions for services provided by central government in various circumstances. Look up all those exemption notifications where there are a lot of entries which say that services provided by central government, state government, local authority will be exempt, will not be taxed. Of course, also realize this, even though most of these exemption notifications will be for a supply of services, the composite and mixed supply rules will apply to them. Therefore, if a service of say education service, that in that education service, books and everything is incidental to the supply of education services, and therefore it will be part of the service. It will not be a separate supply of goods, and therefore any goods which are supplied incidental to all these services which are exempted in the hands of the central government, state government or a local authority, all of them will also become exempt. So, this brings us to the end of our session on government services. Thank you.